Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Alhamdulillah, we thank Allah for the beautiful opportunity that we have here tonight. I think we've been, as a community, very excited about this since we announced it. It's been the last few weeks. It was sort of on short notice, but I'm glad to see that the community turned up and everyone was very happy to be a part of this. You just got a notification on your phone that we're live streaming it. So I want to invite, first and foremost, the Reverend Dr. Michael Waters, his family. So Sister Ulysses, who is a civil rights attorney. There's Jeremiah, raise your hand, Jeremiah. And Hope and Liberty, raise your hands. Okay. And all of our other guests, we want to welcome you all to our community. We want to welcome all the kids as well. Everyone is welcome tonight. So we have a pretty special program ahead. I'm going to, first and foremost, I want to introduce Dr. Michael Waters, and the way that the program will go, after I introduce Dr. Michael Waters, I'll kind of give, for my part at least, I'm going to try to make it as short as possible, so I'm going to give myself 15 minutes to sort of just introduce America's history and how racial biases and religious biases have been used in the past during the political seasons. The various political seasons, at least from the World War I era until now. And then, inshallah, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Michael Waters to take it from there, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So I'll give him free reign. You can talk for an hour if you want. I gave him a very long sermon today. I went 10 minutes over time, so it was a 40-minute sermon today, so they're used to a long one today. But let me introduce Dr. Michael Waters. First, I'll read the formal introduction, just the first paragraph of it, and then I'll say a few words about him as well. So from his formal bio, the Reverend Dr. Michael Waters is founder and senior pastor of Joy Tabernacle African Methodist Episcopal Church here in Dallas. It's one of the newest and fastest growing AME churches in the state of Texas. It was featured in Ebony Magazine he was featured in Ebony Magazine among America's emerging leaders. Dr. Waters' keen insights have been engaged upon such esteemed platforms as the BBC, NewsHour, Newsday Focus on Africa and the Weekend programs, National Public Radio, the NBC Nightly News, Vice on HBO, Huffington Post Live, and the Associated Press. Dr. Waters earned bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees with honors from SMU, from Southern Methodist University here in Dallas, Texas. You're from Houston, I believe, right? Yeah, so he's from Houston, or he moved to Houston at a young age, and I believe he's a Rockets fan, so he was a Hakeem Olajuwon fan growing up. He presently serves as an adjunct instructor in the Doctor of Ministry degree program and as the North Texas Peer Preaching Group Facilitator in the Center for Preaching Excellence at the SMU Perkins School of Theology. And he has a much longer bio. What I'll personally say about Dr. Waters is that he's been a powerful voice in our city against racial injustice of all sorts. And one that comes off as a very genuine character. I'm sure that as you get to know him and interact with him, you'll find him to be someone that's very genuine, that lives far beyond the bio that we have for him. But one of the things that we really appreciate about him is his voice against Islamophobia as well. I personally met Dr. Waters in the vigil that was held after the shooting, the terrorist attack, what's called a terrorist attack, at the AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina by Dylan Roof, where many people from the sister church of Dr. Waters in Charleston were murdered as they were worshiping, and there was a vigil that was held at the Martin Luther King Memorial here in Dallas, and I had a chance to meet him there. And since then, he's constantly been at I've been seeing him in all of these different events, leading not just in the cause of civil rights as far as the African American community is concerned, but really in a much broader sense. And he's spoken very frequently against Islamophobia. And in fact, he received this year at the CARE annual banquet, he received Outstanding Community Leader of the Year. So we thank you for being here. And so basically, again, I'm going to take exactly 15 minutes, and I'll stop in the middle even if I'm not there. I'll even try to finish within 10 minutes. Just about how the political landscape has been historically in America in regards to racial and religious groups. Now, first and foremost, one of the things that historians always say about America's foreign policy and America's policies in general is that it's been extremely cyclical. There is a cycle. It constantly has followed the exact same path. When it comes to foreign policy, because obviously everything that's happening with the Muslim community now is constantly being tied to what's happening overseas and America's foreign policy. When it comes to foreign policy, America is always it's always been an isolationist country where the population does not want to get involved in conflict overseas. No one wants to fight a battle, in Europe or the Middle East or anywhere else. But then the fears are stoked by the powers that be and interest groups. And then just as things are starting to move in a certain direction, spiral in a certain direction, with propaganda, and then in the case of World War II with the attack of Pearl Harbor, suddenly the entire population shifts towards being interventionist and internationalist and wanting to fight overseas. And we have the pro-war lobby, if you will, raising their voices in our country. It has always been that case. And then after the wars and after the conflicts, what you have is this resurfacing of the people that said that we shouldn't have gone to war, and saying, I told you so, because of the destruction that was earned as a result of the wars that we get ourselves into. And so, we can see right now Donald Trump actually calling the Iraq war a big mistake and criticizing George W. Bush for going into Iraq, which is strange considering, it's strange to hear that coming from the Republican platform, right? But again, this is how America's cycle has constantly been. We also have had, our foreign policy has always been based on the concept of the lesser of the two evils. So even though in World War II, most people in this country were anti-German and anti-Russian, but there was a thought that the Germans were not as evil as the Russians, that Nazism was not as bad as communism. And so the surveys back then and the statistics showed that popular belief in America was, let Hitler's regime grow enough to destroy communism and then we'll deal with them. So the concept of the lesser of the two evils has always been embedded in our foreign policy. And it's something that we hear now with Syria, the Assad regime versus ISIS. So why is it that we did not intervene, when 250,000 people were killed by Bashar al-Assad's regime, but then the rise of ISIS, which is a horrible group that has killed mostly Muslims and their terrorism has no bounds, but the casualty count is far less because it threatens our interests. So the idea of which ideology in the world poses a greater threat to us, and using ideologies that we don't necessarily agree with, but supporting those against what we consider to be a greater enemy. Now, of course, when it switched towards Hitler, and when it switched towards Nazism and fascism, then the entire tide of public opinion turned against Germany, and that was embedded in our propaganda and in our media. How does war propaganda work? Now, if you realize every single time you watch anything about Muslims or Arabs in a movie or in a TV show, the message that's embedded within it is that you cannot trust that nice Muslim that lives next door to you. That's always the message that's embedded within it, right? Even when you think that you're finally going to get a good Muslim in a movie, they turn out to be evil in the last half of it, right? In the second half of it. So first, you finally find a kind guest that's inviting someone in, and okay, fine, you've got the bad Muslims, you got 8 bad Muslims in the movie, but you've got the good Muslim in the movie. Eventually, don't trust their biryani, don't trust their maqluba, don't trust their tea. They're really up to no good. They're really trying to kill you. That has been a consistent theme in almost every single TV show and every single movie that has involved Muslims and Arabs. And obviously, the screaming of Allahu Akbar, the stereotyping, the gross portrayals of the Muslim community in just the single light, right? And the idea is that you can't trust them, right? And if you just kind of scan through all the movies you watched over the years, when we're talking about a foreign element, the enemy always starts off as nice or has a nice portrayal. And that paranoia is intentionally stoked, and it's used in politics, and it's used in both domestic and foreign policy to dehumanize a group of people, so that when you hear about a group of Muslims dying, well, a lot of them were probably pretty evil. So that dehumanizing has an impact on both our domestic policy and our foreign policy. And it's translated that way throughout our history. So in World War I, this was where we had the introduction of media propaganda that would push out an American agenda. So in 1917, President Woodrow Wilson established what was known as the CPI, the Committee on Public Information. And basically, this was an entire government-funded committee to infiltrate media so that people would be shifted, and so that people's views would be shifted to what was now America's foreign policy of getting involved in World War I, when President Wilson initially promised the people that we would not get involved in wars that were overseas, right? And so you had what was, obviously back then, media was a lot more primitive. So you had what were known as the 4-Minute Men, and the 4-Minute Men were 75,000 paid men that were sent out by the Committee on Public Information to public squares and to areas in America, where there were large social gatherings, and they literally would give a 4-minute speech, hence the term 4-Minute Men, about why America had to get involved in the wars that were overseas and why America had to take a certain stance at that point. Now, as media got more, more advanced, and we moved on to World War II, in 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt, he created the Office of War Information, which is known as the OWI. Now, their mission was a lot more undercover. Basically, what they did is they approached radio stations and Hollywood, and the messages were being embedded within those movies and within those talk shows and so on and so forth, that America had to get involved to stop the evil ideologies overseas, otherwise they would swallow us up on our shores. And so that penetrated. You also had the famous posters. If you guys have ever seen the World War posters, there were some in World War I and World War II, right? Some of them were just patriotic and telling people to get involved. There were over 200,000 designs, 200,000 different posters that were sent out in the 1940s. And some of them were just about being a great American and really, taking on the responsibility of fighting for your country and dying for your country. And some of them were blatantly racist, right? And that's where you really started to see racist undertones in war propaganda. So you guys know Dr. Seuss? Everyone knows Dr. Seuss. Before he wrote Cat in the Hat, he used to draw anti-Japanese posters. And used to actually was a part of that propaganda machine where racist literature was being produced, racist comics, racist drawings about the Japanese. And those attitudes translated into fear of all of the Japanese Americans that were around. We're talking about over 150,000 at the time. Now, what does that lead to? At some point, the fears of Japanese Americans, and that all Japanese people, and this might sound very familiar to you, that all Japanese Americans were part of this single conspiracy, right? To overthrow the governments around the world and to establish their brand, that brand of communism. Those fears continued to grow and fester until obviously you had the internment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans in 1942. Now, what happened there? Now, every single time there is a terrorist attack, what is the first thing that a Muslim thinks? We hope it's not a Muslim, right? That's almost always the case. We hope it's not a Muslim. And it's sad because obviously we have to, we grieve as human beings when those things happen, but at the same time, we have to worry about if it turns out to be a Muslim, immediately Islam is the culprit, immediately it feeds that idea that all Muslims are secretly part of this conspiracy, and they're trying to overthrow what Ben Carson called civilization jihad, what Ted Cruz's paranoid foreign policy advisors call stealth jihad, where they're all going to go and plant themselves in these different places and overthrow the government and implement Sharia law, right? We always fear that attack. Now, what happened with World War II is that there was anti-German sentiment, there was anti-Russian sentiment, but what made anti-Japanese sentiment so prominent in America? Does anyone know? For one, it was simple racism, that the Japanese looked a lot different, and they spoke a lot differently. So just truly, if you read about the history of it, they looked very different, they spoke a lot differently, so the anti-Asian attitude just unfortunately permeated the American structure to where the Japanese Americans were discriminated against far more. The other thing is that on the West Coast, where Americans were living, the only thing that separated them from everything that was going on overseas was the Pacific Ocean. So there was this idea that it was only a matter of time before the Japanese made their way over the Pacific and they attacked the West Coast. So there were a lot of fears, and there was a lot of, there were a lot of people that had these, this paranoia about the Japanese. But what changed everything? Pearl Harbor. When Pearl Harbor happened in America, suddenly all of that racism became valid. Right? All the horrible posters, even the voices that rose against those posters and rose against that racism that was being put out there against the Japanese, suddenly all of that became valid, and suddenly it all became legitimate. And so at that time, you now have an opportunity where you can take this huge group of people, over 100,000 Japanese people, okay, 60 to 80% of them actually being American citizens, and put them in internment camps because people were afraid that they all belonged to this conspiracy. And it is one of the most shameful chapters of American history, obviously, but it's something it's valuable for us to understand that otherness was emphasized when dealing with the Japanese. That concept of otherness, that they're really here on this part of a plot. You don't understand what they're talking about, you don't understand what they're saying, but it's only a matter of time before they try to replace the current government that we have, and suddenly we enter into a new dark chapter in our foreign policy. We also see at that time that one of the tactics of the administration was to portray anyone that was anti-war as being a Nazi sympathizer in the 1940s. In the 1950s, there's McCarthyism, where anyone that was anti-war in any way or that was against America's foreign policy was portrayed as a secret communist sympathizer and as really belonging to a communist agenda. So again, the way that you would discredit someone, any legitimate government dissent, is you would portray them as being foreign agents. And it's been employed since then in many different ways. Now that's as far as race is concerned outside of the religious element of it. Now for Muslims, for many Muslims, you have to deal with both the racial undertones and you have to deal with the religious undertones. And obviously Dr. Waters is going to touch on the African American, the racism, the historic racism towards the African American community and how they dealt with that in his presentation. But the idea here is that otherness was what was emphasized, and dissent was criminalized by associating people with foreign agendas. The fear has always been, historically, that these people belong to something un-American, and they're here to try to overthrow the American system. So if you think about the anti-Sharia hysteria, it falls within the same line of thinking, right? That 1% of the population is somehow going to impose their will. First of all, they all believe in the same ideology, and they're all going to impose their will on our government, and it's happening in every state to the point that 37 states had to criminalize it, or had to try to pass bills to criminalize it. It's the same line of thinking and paranoia. Now when it comes to religion, and I'm going to sort of run through this inshallah, then I'll hand it over to Dr. Waters. When it comes to religion, anti-Catholicism in this country also falls in the same line of otherness, that they belong to something else. And anti-Catholicism is as old in America as slavery, practically. All right, if you read about the Founding Fathers, there are some anti-Catholic tendencies in there, very strong anti-Catholic messaging. Why? Because the idea was that you could not be a loyal American and be a loyal Catholic at the same time. That your religion conflicts you into having to choose one or the other. You cannot possibly embrace those two identities. And so that anti-Catholic sentiment has run through American history, dating all the way back to the Founding Fathers and into the 20th century. Before President Kennedy, you only had one presidential nominee that was Catholic. Only one presidential nominee that was Catholic. And most people probably don't know his name, but it was Governor Alfred Smith. And you know what was employed against Governor Alfred Smith? There was a rumor that spread that Governor Smith, as he was running for president, was trying to build a tunnel connecting the White House to the Vatican. So his plan was actually to build a tunnel connecting the White House to the Vatican. And this was in mainstream media in America in the 1920s, that he was trying to build it, and his plan was to issue an executive order to place the Vatican's orders over the Constitution. Obviously, that cost him the election, and it also led to a lot of anti-Catholic behavior, and there were even some hate crimes that took place against Catholics as a result of that. Now, fast forward to 1960, John F. Kennedy. JFK in 1960, who's running for president, who's very popular, who is a Catholic, had to give a speech to 150 Protestant ministers, where? In Houston, Texas, convincing them that he was not out to become the first Catholic president of the United States, but instead to be the first instead to be an American president who happened to be Catholic. He literally had to give a speech to 150 ministers emphasizing that he will uphold the doctrine of separation of church and state, because that's how high the skepticism was. And I'll just read for you a portion of it. He said that, for while this year it may be a Catholic against whom the finger of suspicion is pointed, in other years it has been and may someday be again a Jew or a Quaker or a Unitarian or a Baptist. It was Virginia's harassment of Baptist preachers, for example, that led to Jefferson's statute of religious freedom. Today I may be the victim, but tomorrow it may be you, until the whole fabric of our harmonious society is ripped apart at a time of great national peril. Finally, I believe in an America where religious intolerance will someday end, where all men and all churches are treated as equals, where every man has the same right to attend or not attend the church of his choice, where there is no Catholic vote, no anti-Catholic vote, no block voting of any kind, and where Catholics, Protestants, and Jews at both the lay and the pastoral levels will refrain from those attitudes of disdain and division which have so often marred their works in the past, and promote instead the American ideal of brotherhood. So that was actually a powerful portion of that speech that he gave that day. But of course he went on to become the first and only Catholic president that we've ever had in this country. And then of course you have anti-Semitism, and I'll just mention this part here. Many people don't know this, but when World War II happened, Jewish refugees were viewed by the tongue of the president as a national security threat. Those were the words that were used by President Roosevelt and the State Department to describe Jewish refugees of World War II, that they posed a great national security threat because they were bringing agendas that were unknown to us, and that they would somehow find a way to overthrow our economic system and somehow find a way to take over the country. Sound familiar? The same language that's being employed towards Syrian refugees. It's a national security threat. They're here to take over. They've all been infiltrated. They're all here with an agenda. So once again, the otherness was emphasized. So that's the religious bigotry. But guess what? If you look at the Supreme Court, you have how many Catholics on the Supreme Court? 5 Catholics and 3 Jews make up the current 8 members of the Supreme Court. If Obama's nominee Garland makes it through, that makes it 4 Jews, 5 Catholics and 4 Jews. Meaning the tide turns very, very, very quickly in this country. Right? It's one group today, it's another group tomorrow, and it continues to move on forward in that way. The most important thing as we move forward is that we have to show that we have a stake in this country, and that this is our country, just as much our country as anyone else, and not allow ourselves to constantly be portrayed as the other. Because whether it's religious bigotry or racism, it's constantly the idea of the other and being boxed into this concept, this framing of the other, having an agenda, not really belonging, wanting to do something else. And obviously that comes through human interaction and asserting ourselves in the political, social realm as much as we can. And this is where, and I told Dr. Waters, I'd mentioned this and I'd fade into him, what's known as the Double V campaign. In World War II, African Americans served in the army, in the military, and were even degraded within the military. So there was even segregation within the military. You can imagine the feeling. You're going to die for a country that hates you, and where you're being treated like not a second-class citizen, but a third or a fourth-class citizen. And even within the military, you're being degraded and you're being relegated to humiliating conditions as you're dying for that country. And the Double V campaign represents a turning point in American history, where on February 7th, 1942, the Pittsburgh Courier put out this concept of a double V campaign, obviously meaning double victory. That just as we're fighting for justice abroad, we're also fighting for our freedom and our justice here in this country. And you can't expect us to go out and die for this country in other parts of the world if we're not going to be treated like equal citizens within this country. That's a turning point in American history. It really, really is. And what you find is that when desegregation took place in the military, it made way for desegregation in other areas as well. So that was the first turning point, or it's one of the turning points, one of the major turning points in American history, where the idea, once again, of being part and parcel of this country and not allowing ourselves to be placed into the frame of the other or being, un-American in any way, led to an actual change within this country. As far as Muslim Americans are concerned, we're very well integrated economically, moderately integrated socially, and incredibly poorly politically. That's the description of the Muslim community. Economically, doing very well. Socially, we're really not that different from other communities at all. But politically, unfortunately, consistently polling low, low political activism. There's still a hesitation to believe in any way that this community of however many millions of people can actually impact the political process in this country. Now, just the light at the end of the tunnel, according to Pew Research, in the year 2040, that's not very long, in the year 2040, Muslims will be the second largest religious group in America. Think about that. Meaning the tide is turning, and eventually it moves on to another group, and another group will be discriminated against. And what we have to do is we have to align ourselves with all like-minded people, white, black, Latino, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, whatever it may be, that are fighting a common enemy of bigotry and not allowing this divisive rhetoric to actually translate into a divided or a more divided America. So we have to be willing to fight that bigotry at all levels. But there is reason to be optimistic, and as poor as our political showing has been, it's at least consistently improving, and hopefully it'll continue to improve. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Waters, and you have the rest of the evening. And I'll let him speak as long as he'd like to, and then we'll open it up for questions. And as I said, we're going to delay Salat al-Isha tonight. We're going to delay our prayer to 10-15 minutes at least afterwards. Jazakallah, thank you.
Good evening. I'm honored to come and to share with you tonight to my dear friend, Imam Omar, with whom I've had the privilege of standing on many occasions for the cause of justice. I honor you and I thank you for being such a vital voice, not only in the midst of the Muslim community, but to all communities of peace and goodwill. Please know that I count it a privilege and an honor to sit with you tonight, to share with all of you who have assembled some considerations concerning this present hour. But I want to put it in the context of our history, because in many ways I believe that a clear view and knowledge of history gives you a clearer view and understanding of the present and of the future. So on September the 15th in 1963, that the members of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama gathered as they did every Sunday in order to worship. And on that particular Sunday, it was Youth Sunday, which meant that the young people were given charge with providing leadership for that worship service. Early that morning, the pastor received a phone call that was disturbing. That phone call offered a warning that they needed to vacate the premises. As the pastor was receiving that phone call, young people were gathering together and mingling with one another in the basement area as they were preparing to lead worship. There was a young lady by the name of Junie Collins, and she played the piano. And she had the responsibility of playing the piano for that Sunday worship. And so she climbed the stairs to the second floor sanctuary to prepare herself for worship. Her sister, Ada Mae Collins, along with 3 other friends, decided that they would go to the ladies' room to also prepare themselves for worship. And while they were there in that ladies' room, a bomb exploded. And when those 4 young girls were found, they were found laying on top of each other, the impact of that bomb so great that it literally blew them together. It is said that as they sought to identify the bodies, the only way that they could tell who one young lady was by the shoes that still adorned her feet. I had the opportunity to meet Judy Collins Williams a few years ago as she recounted the story of the loss of these 4 young girls, not to mention the many others who were seriously injured, even blinded in the blast, and asked her a question. The question that I wanted to know is, what should be my responsibility to my generation and to future generations concerning all that her generation had faced and had to struggle? And she said 2 things. She wanted me to tell present and future generations that many men and women fought long and hard for them to have the opportunities and freedoms that they now enjoy. But the second thing she wanted me to share was to tell them that it was God who brought us over. That it was our faith in the omnipotent God that gave us the strength to continue to hope even when times felt hopeless, to continue to dream even when we had more nightmares than dreams, to continue to believe in the promise of a better day even when we had no evidence of that fact in our day. And so I've always said that it is our responsibility to share the stories of struggle even in the midst of trauma, because somehow in the midst of all of those things, God has brought us over. It's the first chapter of my book that I want to present to you tonight, entitled "They Reminisce Over You, My God." And I want to talk about that tonight because in many ways, as a Muslim community, you are facing some of the same struggles and challenges that our community faced. And I hope tonight that my presence can serve for you as a bit of hope in the midst of these trying times. To know that just as our people were able to overcome through their faith in God, that you will be able to do the same. We're talking about propaganda and this otherness, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that because it's a very interesting and reciprocal form that has informed much of American society. When Africans were brought to America as slaves, they were usually received as hard workers, as individuals who could be trusted to care for their master's property. When you look at the antebellum period of the 19th century, oftentimes slaves were depicted as happy and joyful servants. There were books such as Uncle Tom's Cabin that presented these African slaves, these black slaves, as individuals who enjoyed doing the work of their master. But it's very interesting how that image changed after the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the Reconstruction era. Those same individuals who were presented as docile and as hardworking and as trustworthy began to be presented as brutes, as savages, as persons who needed to be put down, lest they take over the entire nation and cause great harm and concern. I believe that depiction and that propaganda met its zenith in 1915. There was a movie released called The Birth of a Nation. Historically, it is the first movie that was ever shown at the White House. And the height of that movie, of the tension of that movie, showed a white woman as she was running through the woods. She was being chased by a white man wearing blackface. And the suggestion in that chase was that this man sought to harm her physically and to take from her her virtue. There was a white man who was then following behind both of them, seeking to rescue this white woman from this black savage. And ultimately, the white woman came upon a cliff where she had to make a decision as to whether or not she would allow this black savage to touch her or if she would jump off the cliff. And according to the movie, she chose the most noble thing, which was to leap to her death. That it was better to die falling from a cliff than to be touched by this black man. Another scene showed the halls of Congress as these former slaves were sitting together with their feet on the desk, eating chicken and watermelon, joking and scratching in the midst of the halls of Congress. And the heroes of the day for that movie were individuals who were dressed in white robes, the Ku Klux Klan, who came to save the day from these black savages. As you look at the Reconstruction era and as you look at the propaganda that went forth from the Reconstruction era and the presentation of the black as a savage, as the Sambo, as the Pickaninny, you also see an increase in lynching. And lynching history in America really has done more to shape our nation geographically and politically than any other atrocity in American history. Lynching was so great specifically in the South, that an entire generation of individuals began to migrate to places in the West, the Midwest, and the North. In fact, the greatest migration of individuals in the history of America was largely motivated by this desire to escape physical harm. Why were so many black men and women and children lynched? It was because of this image that had been promoted throughout society, that if they were not put down, they would destroy us. I see some parallels with that history to what is happening in present day for the Muslim community. As you've already referenced, that so many times within our national dialogue, Muslims are the holy other, to be concerned, to be fearful. I am troubled by those sentiments, how they have created harm, not only for the Muslim community, but in fact for our entire nation. Many of you here know that firsthand. Being discriminated against, having individuals to be fearful of you who never even bothered to have the opportunity to meet you, to have a conversation with you, to understand your heart and desire for your family, for your mosque, for the betterment of our young people. The question is then, how do we overcome this moment? How do we continue to move forward in the midst of this maddening dialogue where presidential candidates have called for a moratorium on the entry of Muslim into America? What do we do when there are presidential candidates who are talking about monitoring neighborhoods? I'm sure many of you here, and it would be understandably so, feel rather exhausted by all of this. I'm sure many of you tonight sometimes feel as though I'm at my limit. Like was said before, so many times when a tragedy does happen because of the climate here in this nation, your first response is, well, I hope that is no one projecting themselves to be a Muslim, to represent me in my faith. How do we stay encouraged? How do we stay hopeful? Well, several years ago, I had the opportunity of starting a civil rights pilgrimage at Southern Methodist University. Went throughout the Deep South to the places, the shrines of the civil rights movement. We went to Jackson, Mississippi. I've literally looked upon the driveway where Medgar Evers, who was a voting rights activist, was assassinated on June the 12th, 1963. I've traveled to that Birmingham church, 16th Street, and I've looked into the area. Now a kitchen used to be the bathroom where those 4 young girls lost their lives. Yes, I've even been in Memphis, Tennessee, to look upon the balcony where the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated 48 years ago this past Monday. And as I've traveled those places and had an opportunity to speak with those individuals who fought for justice and were a part of the civil rights movement, I have asked them specifically this question: how did you have hope? How did you continue to endure? What allowed you to wake up each day believing that this day will be better than the last? And Imam Omar, they shared with me only the same thing. It was our faith in God. Because when you have nothing left, you have your faith to hold you and to keep you strong. That faith that draws you in as community, that will not allow you to give up on hope, and will cause you to always work towards a better day. I wish I could sit before you tonight and tell you that it will soon be over. That young boys who make clocks will not be accused of making bombs. I wish I could tell you it will soon be over. That you could walk through the airport. That you can take a seat on the airplane without fear and trepidation of those around you. I wish I could tell you it will soon be over. I wish I could tell you it will soon be over, and that when we reach that day that Dr. King spoke so powerfully about, that we would not be judged by the color of our skin or by our faith, but by the content of our character. But I can't tell you that. What I can tell you is that if you hold on to your faith and you remain together in community, that you will be strong and that you will be able to overcome. And so it was last June, while I was in Portland, Oregon, speaking at a conference, that I returned that evening to my hotel room and turn on the television to breaking news that 9 individuals within my denomination were gathering together for a Bible study. And a young man entered in and joined them for over an hour as the preacher taught from our sacred text. And after Bible study had concluded, the young man arose from the table and showed his weapon. And he said, "You all are so nice. I almost was not going to do this, but I just have to." And systematically, this young man killed 9 beautiful souls. I know very well the daughter of one young lady killed that night, Ethel Lance. I know her daughter, Reverend Sharon Misher, who has worshiped within our community on several times, with whom I've had the privilege of standing for the cause of justice. And oftentimes I look at her and ask myself, how is it possible to lose your mother in such a heinous way and yet still have hope and have belief? And she has told me, yes, even with tears in her eyes, it's hard. I don't always feel like it, but I feel a call to continue to work so that others will not face the same thing our family has had to face. Our faith will keep us strong. Our hope together will keep us focused. And our belief in a power greater than ourselves will guide the way. So humbled to share with you tonight, and I look forward to receiving your questions and comments.
Thank you, Dr. Waters. And so the book that you just gave me is Freestyle, Reflections on Faith, Family, Justice, and Pop Culture. I appreciate the book. I was going to order it off of Amazon, so you just saved me some money. All right, great. I'm going to ask the first question, if you guys don't mind. What did that week look like after the shootings in Charleston? What did it look like for your community? If you could kind of give us some sort of an insight into that, I think it would be valuable.
Sure. So for me, it was very difficult because I was out of town. I was away from our worship community, away from my family. To be honest with you, I didn't get much sleep that night, as you can imagine. And probably around 3 o'clock in the morning, I was going to fly out just a few hours later. I did what I often do when I need to process. I began to write. So I wrote a piece that ultimately appeared the next day on the front page of the Huffington Post, called "The Sound of Grief in Charleston." So I think really that first 24 hours, there was a lot of shock to the system. There were persons within our denomination with whom I'm close to, who knew intimately some of the victims. So we were trying to provide consoling to them. The community just pulling together to try to provide support. But ultimately, after that 24-hour period had passed, we started having real strong conversations about what do we do now? What is our responsibility in the midst of this hour? And I think one of the great concerns was that maybe the community would respond to this tragedy with rioting or by also beginning to return violence for violence. And in fact, you saw the very opposite. Individuals began to hold vigil at the church, began to offer prayers and support for the victims. The entire community of Charleston began to put their arms around one another. began to march for peace. And I believe that peace became the greatest witness over the next several days. Yes, there was a desire for justice, but once they caught Dylann Roof, many of you may remember when he appeared in court for the first time, there were members of the family who expressed their grief, but at the same time, somehow powerfully, I know through the help of God, were able to say, I forgive you. I forgive you. I don't understand why you did what you did, but I forgive you. That place comes from a great sense of faith. You can't forgive someone for such an atrocity unless you have a strongly rooted faith and a hope that cannot be quenched by tragedy. So what we saw over the next, that week and then on to the next several weeks, we began sending aid and support to that church. And please allow me to pause parenthetically and also acknowledge the tremendous support that came from the Muslim community, not only for Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, but for the many other churches who were also burned over that same period of time. Please allow me to acknowledge and celebrate and offer my thanks for that work and support and solidarity. But I think that first week, once information came out and once we knew what had taken place, the next work was to build and to restore community, but to do so in peace.
Questions? I'm just going to open it up to the floor. Yes?
I apologize if this seems obvious from the outside, but at the moment people are afraid of Muslims because supposedly we represent a foreign influence or a threat to national security, or the new community, or we're the new flavor in marginalized communities. What's the big deal with attacking black churches? What are people afraid of? Where is this coming from?
Wonderful question. Yeah, so the question was, what is the fear, or what is the reasoning behind, if I can say, attacking black churches? One, because it's the source of power for the community, source of faith, source of organization, the leader of justice, okay? The church in the African American context, really for the long part of the African American experience, has been the epicenter of community. There have been a number of colleges and universities that have been founded and established out of churches. It's been a place of networking and of business. And during the days of the Civil Rights Movement and others, it was a place where individuals came to gather to not only strategize, but to encourage and support one another again before they returned in their fight for justice. And so oftentimes it became an easy target because those who sought to cause harm knew that it was such a central portion and part of the African American community. And unfortunately, that still happens today. Some people don't know this. There's a gentleman by the name of Anthony B. Penn. He's a professor of religion at Rice University in Houston, and he has a wonderful book entitled The Black Church in the Post-Civil Rights Era. And most individuals don't know that in the 1990s, there were more church burnings of black churches than in any other period in American history. So a lot of people thought that just with the civil rights movement, that meant the end of these attacks against the church, but in fact, the 1990s saw a great boom in churches that were burned down.
Reverend, I want to thank you again for coming out on the Project Network and your family. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Talk to us about anger. As we're trying to deal with this, with injustice, peace, and solidarity, we have issues with anger among our youth, among our elders. From your experience that you had, how have your community dealt with this?
That's a great question. And there's been a multiplicity of ways in which it has been dealt with. Okay, I'm sorry, to repeat the question. How have our community, particularly young people, I would imagine, dealt with anger in response to the difficulties that have been experienced? And once again, I want to say there's been a multiplicity of responses. There's not been one monolithic response. by African Americans in particular over time. Sometimes the response has been very peaceful. Sometimes it has been violent. Dr. King said that rioting is in fact the language of the unheard. And he would often give a warning that under too much pressure and too much challenge, a riot may be what you can expect. Although he never advocated for it, never endorsed it, he still understood that sometimes those kind of explosive responses happen. For those who have chosen the way of peace, though, let me tell you that many times that peace is fomented by anger. Okay? That might sound mutually exclusive, but it's not. I want to suggest that one of the angriest persons to ever walk the face of this country was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He hated hate. He despised racism with a passion. That hate of hate and that anger became the fuel for a nonviolent direct action movement. Now, oftentimes these movements are relatively unattractive to young people today because it seems to take so long. And we want our rights now. We want to be free now. We want things to change today. Oftentimes, the tragedy of moving forth in anger is ultimately you end up causing more harm to your community and to your cause than good. So, for instance, while we understand that rioting is the voice of the unheard, oftentimes in American history, particularly in the African American community, when African Americans have rioted, they've done so in their own community, causing millions and at times $1 billion of damage, creating even more difficulties in a socially and economically disadvantaged community. The question you have to ask yourself is what is the end game? What do you hope to achieve? If you harm someone and they harm you back, now you have joined this back and forth that knows no end. But if you take a proactive move and you begin to strategize together in community, you can begin to change things, be it through the laws, be it through political activism, be it through the transformation of the hearts of people. I'll say this. Part of the reason Dr. King believed that nonviolent social action was the way to go was Dr. King recognized that far more than trying to change minds, it was about changing hearts. It's about allowing individuals to see the humanity within me and ultimately see that we are one and the same. And he understood that that was an arduous process, and yes, there was a lot of difficulties there, but I believe that history has shown that to be the right path. Because more change, even though there's still a great amount of change that's still left to be achieved, so much happened because of the successes of nonviolent direct action.
I'm going to add to that, I think it was Benjamin Franklin who said that if you make peaceful revolution impossible, then you make violent revolution inevitable. And that's one of the things, anger is an important thing. Even it's something that we feed off of, but it's how you channel that anger. And that's something that we learned from our prophet, peace be upon him, as well. One of the descriptions of him was that he did not allow his anger to make him unjust, but at the same time, he channeled it in a way that it called for effective social change. And I think Dr. Waters, one of the first conversations that Dr. Waters and myself had was about Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy, Malcolm X Rahimullah's philosophy, and so on and so forth. And one of the great lies of Martin Luther King Jr. about Martin Luther King Jr. was that he was, and we know he was nonviolent, but that he was okay with the situation, that the I Have a Dream speech was the only speech he ever gave, and that he was not a controversial and polarizing figure. I mean, breaking the silence, if you read the speech, Breaking the Silence, where he called against the Vietnam War, Martin Luther King Jr. was censored or was even by the NAACP. He was considered to be a radical. the last speech that he was supposed to give, and I'm not saying, you know, the last speech he was supposed to give, what was the title? Why America might go to hell. That was the speech he wrote and he was going to give the day after his assassination. And so the speech is actually there. You could read the speech, but Martin Luther King Jr. did call, you know, very forcefully out the ills, the three-headed monster of justice. And so the philosophies, especially if you study Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, rahimahullah, towards the end, they really came to almost of a middle ground of sorts. And so I think that's what it is. You have to, sometimes the approaches are going to be a little bit different. As long as they're ethical and complementary, it's okay. Even in the Muslim community, we have to understand that. That sometimes you're going to have an organization that's going to demand that when someone is being unjust or when someone is being wrong, that's going to demand justice for that person. And then you're going to have the Muslims that are going to play the role of smiling and saying, we forgive you and we love you and come to our mosque and let's talk about Islam a little bit. You're going to have those complementary approaches. As long as they're all ethical, it's okay. And that's something that we have to understand as well as the Muslim community. It's okay to have different approaches as long as they're ethical and complementary and they're not undermining one another or counterproductive. Yes?
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So my question is that a lot of people don't completely understand or like articulate racism in different communities. So like, for example, like I know some Muslims who like have experienced Islamophobia and like talk about how horrible it was for them, but then they undermine the experiences of African Americans because they don't believe that that's the problem. So as a civil rights activist, like how do you believe that you can change those ignorant perspectives? Like how do you tell them like you've experienced something that's painful and they have experienced something that's painful? Like it's the same thing.
Just to repeat her question, she said, how do we stop, obviously a lot of Muslims are angry about Islamophobia, but when one group is being targeted, how do you stop that group from undermining or taking away from the cause of another group of people where they underestimate what others are going through? And just to say, you know, the from Palestine to Ferguson movement was one of the most powerful movements that we've seen of uniting causes and things of that sort. So that is changing, but it is still a big issue, and I'd like you to address that as well.
Absolutely, and let me respond by in this manner. I think one of the things we all have to wrestle with is that all of us have a level of bias and prejudice. It's inherent to who we are as human beings. And the way towards justice and love is first by acknowledging where those prejudices and bias lie and then working proactively to change it. So I think the first step that happens is to try to help your friends or those who you have an opportunity to influence to see that if they're not careful, they may become what they hate. They may begin to show the same prejudice against others that has been shown against them. And I think that's a great danger when you're fighting for justice, is it becomes all about you and all about your people and all about your cause. And sometimes you can fail to see what's an opportunity to stand in solidarity and even align yourselves with those who are fighting for the same thing. Is it possible to be Muslim and racist? Absolutely. Is it possible to be African American and prejudiced against Muslims? Absolutely. Once those things are exposed, though, you have to work to make things better. So in a very pointed way, how do you change it? You change it by holding people accountable. That might sound a little tough, but some things we do that are tough, we must do in love. Meaning that if I'm with my Muslim brothers and sisters and they say something that I know is prejudiced or racist against someone else, I'm obligated for the cause of love to tell them, no, we cannot do this. We cannot say these things. We cannot become what we hate. So it didn't happen on some kind of large scale, preaching change from a pulpit, but it happens one-on-one in intimate conversations where you let those around you know that we'll do things a better way.
right, we'll take.
How many more questions you got?
Thank you.
You could whisper in my ear and tell me how tired you really are. I think three more questions. Who had their hand up first amongst the brothers?
The Holy Quran says that if you kill one innocent person, it means that you have killed the whole humanity. Islam has got no scope for terrorism, doesn't promote terrorism. What happens is that if you look at the history, particularly in Middle East, it is the international policies which has created problems, and the Muslim population has suffered the most. Now, the creation of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, it is because of the international policies. How we can control the international policies?
Can I give a quick? I'll share something there, inshallah, which I think the question is, how do we stop international? Because international policies have created a fertile ground for extremist groups and terrorist groups. Look, one of the things that we have on our side when we have this discussion is statistics, facts, experts, and not Frank Gaffney, Ted Cruz experts, or Donald Trump experts, but like actual experts and people that are in the field of intelligence and that have sort of studied, how things have gone in the Middle East and things of that sort. So, where ISIS doesn't get attributed to Islam, but it gets attributed to Iraq being bombed by 4 consecutive U.S. presidents, and a very fertile ground for hopelessness, and hopelessness becomes a ground for extremism when the economy is destroyed, when the political system is destroyed, when it's complete anarchy. It doesn't matter what country in the world, extremist groups are going to rise up, which is one thing that we have to actually teach people that. We have to educate people that, because a lot of people don't know that. They do think that, someone just read the Quran one day and decided, hey, we should create ISIS in a completely healthy country and a healthy economy and healthy whatever it is, and they went and created ISIS. So we first have to be able to tell people, look at the facts. This is not coming, even the terrorists, where they're coming from. It's really interesting. Today, the breaking news was about the Paris suspects and the Brussels suspects. These men were all alcoholics. How religious could they have possibly been, right? And from an Islamic perspective, they're alcoholics, they go to clubs, they're not religious at all, but they're young people that had no hope, that had no future, and so they're prone to these types of things, these types of destructive ideologies. So we have to be able to argue with facts. The second thing, what we need to understand is that when we allow ourselves to be dehumanized in America, it also allows for destructive foreign policy, because your Muslim brothers and sisters and your brothers and sisters in humanity that live in other countries where people have been dehumanized, it doesn't hurt that much anymore when you hear 200 people were killed in a terrorist attack or in a drone strike. It doesn't hurt anymore because they've been dehumanized. So we have to humanize the people that are the victims of just really bad foreign policy. And that's it. You're still a very loyal American if you criticize foreign policy. That's part of what the country is all about, being able to voice those types of frustrations. And that's, again, in a healthy discussion, okay? Which is why Muslims are primarily lining up behind a Jewish socialist candidate for president, right? It's, we can discuss foreign policy in a healthy way, but don't, the dehumanizing part, and that's the one message that I want everyone to take from the discussion, is when we allow ourselves to be dehumanized and become the other, then all of those bad policies, domestically and foreign, suddenly have validation and are legitimized in the eyes of the public.
Wonderful question. One of my great concerns on foreign policy plane is where America shows interest and where America shows disinterest in the suffering of people. So for instance, Boko Haram in the mother continent of Africa has been stated to be the most violent terrorist organization in the world. Its victims are have primarily been Black Africans. And yet you've not seen the US government send planes and troops to liberate those people. It's always interesting the places we choose to fight for freedom and the places where we remain silent. Oftentimes, what we say is for freedom is really for US interests, to expand our economies, to create new allies so that our commerce can move throughout the globe without restriction. It's one of the great pains of foreign policy, but the question you ask is, what can we do about it? And I think it goes back to where we began, which is within a democracy, your vote is everything. Your participation in the political process is everything. And I'm very passionate about voting. My wife can tell you that on election day, I refuse to vote early. It's a personal decision. I don't like voting on an early ballot. That's not against you if you do. Please feel free to continue. But for me, voting is a spiritual experience. Why is it a spiritual experience? Because so many men and women died, were beaten, were attacked by dogs, so that I could have the right to vote. So when it's time to vote, I put on my best suit, I shine my shoes, and I walk into the ballot box. Because I'm doing it because someone died so I can have that opportunity. I pray that no one in this room would leave here without seeing the value of your vote, because your vote is your voice. And if you're not registered to vote, I hope you go tomorrow or Monday to make sure that you're able to participate in this process. People literally died. I'll say this very quickly. Medgar Evers, I mentioned him earlier, Jackson, Mississippi, fighting for the right to vote, was a field secretary of the NAACP. June the 12th, 1963, at midnight, came home late at night, went to the back of his truck, and was shot with a deer rifle. The bullet penetrated through his back, burst out of his chest, went through the wall in the living room, went through the wall in the kitchen, ricocheted off of the refrigerator, and landed in the kitchen sink. And when his wife came to the door, he had pulled himself on the ground around the station wagon up to the front steps. And when I went to Jackson, Mississippi with a woman named Chloe Graves, someone in our group asked the question, where did Medgar Evers die? And Chloe Graves told us, you're standing in his blood. And when we looked down on the ground, some 40 years later, there was still a red taint upon the concrete. We were standing in his blood. He died so we can vote. Do not complain about what is going on in our nation if you have not had the audacity and passion to take yourself to the ballot box. Matter of fact, you are a part of the problem if you fail to vote. Make your voice known as a community and as a people for the way in which this government should move.
If anyone else from the sisters has a question, otherwise I'll go back to you. Okay, go ahead, sisters.
Given the progress, and obviously it's not been perfect or complete by any stretch of the imagination, of the American mainstream media towards, civil rights goals, it's not acceptable any longer socially to be anti-black. It's not okay. I mean, even though on TV, obviously representation is really low, Oscars so white, hashtag that was ridiculous. This all exists, but why is there still this deep-seated hatred? Is this financial? Is this, what are the maintaining variables of this? Where is this coming from?
Of hatred towards, just so I'm clear on the question, where does the hate towards African Americans continue? Is that what you're asking? Or
Yeah, because you guys are Christian, the other people are Christian. Where is this coming from?
So, I recently wrote an article in the Huffington Post. You can look it up if you are interested, where I talk about how Christian theology has been invented over time within the Western Hemisphere. There are depictions of art all the way from Michelangelo in the Sixtine Chapel and forward, where God, Christ, was presented as a white man with European features. That is a creating of the image of Christ in European image's own image, right? Because they saw themselves as one and the same. Anytime you make God white or depict God as white, then God is white like you, and it feeds into white supremacy, okay? So even today, when many Americans who call themselves Christian conceive of God, the vision they have of God is not of a man who grew up in Galilee, Palestine. They see an image of an individual who came up in the Renaissance in Europe. And when you have that type of imaging and you then put that God as the God of white supremacy, then what is the opposite of white in many cases is perceived to be black. And so that same theology that presented God as white presented black as the devil. And there are literally people today who still believe that if African Americans are not the devil, they're very close. That they are inherently violent, monstrous, and are not to be trusted, much like what you said with the Muslim community. So, in all honesty, we're talking about years and years and centuries of this programming of bad theology that has had this significant issue and impact upon society. Please know that the Ku Klux Klan considers themselves to be a Christian organization. That's why they burned the cross. The cross is on fire. It's a sign of strength. Please know that there are persons even today who continue to promote it. I want to disagree to an extent. While you do not hear in mainstream such derogatory terms as you once did against African Americans, many of you have heard African Americans referred to as thugs. Same connotation, just a different word. Same impact to degrade an entire society. So think about what happened when a young African American man by the name of Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson, Missouri by Darren Wilson. Remember what Darren Wilson said. He said that he looked like a demon. This young boy looked like a demon. And so that takes it to a spiritual plane. And if you believe this individual is a demon to be destroyed, not only are you demonizing him and his community, but you're elevating yourself to a place of God.
Last question. Abu Ahmed.
I have a question about two questions. I've been teaching in some colleges for too many years. I haven't seen serious movement toward educating and empowering the young generation, like having seminars in many colleges that we talk about, like discrimination and other important topics. I haven't seen a serious effort to get together different, ethnic groups and different, like minority groups, that they work together. That would make me one of those people whenever I walk and I try to vote, and I have to choose between the devil and the devil, because I'm not seeing a serious movement toward, for example, why you need to choose between Democratic and Republican, for example. The moment I was about to select anybody from the Republican, I can visualize the millions of Iraqi people who get killed in Iraq. But while Bush, the son and the father there. Same thing is happening in Syria now under the Democratic Party, when we have Afro-American leader. So again, the process is good, but we are not serious. I'm not feeling that we are serious. We talk in the mosques, we talk in the churches, but actual thing, going to the people and reaching the people, especially in colleges, it's almost zero.
Yeah, sure. And I think you offer some great points. I think there's a difference between a political movement and a social movement. And I think both are needed for change. When you don't vote, you, in essence, put someone else in power. You tell them you control the checkbook, you control who my judges are, you control who my DA is, you control the policies that we set, and I've done nothing to try to sway you or to put someone in I believe that is more aligned with our views. Another thing that's important concerning the political process is if you don't see someone that you believe reflects your morals, your values, then select a candidate from your group who does. How many Muslims are sitting on the city council of Irving and Valley Ranch?
It's not looking good.
It's not looking good. Huh? At some point, you got to decide, is there a candidate among us who we can support, who can be our voice? Otherwise, you continue to tell someone else, continue to write the checks for me, continue to decide who will be over me, right? So what happened in Ferguson, which is a hallmark of racial discrimination in America, is after the uprising that took place with Michael Brown, people voted who had never voted before. There were more African Americans in that community than anybody else, and people just didn't decide to vote because they didn't see any value in it. And when the people voted, guess what? There were persons who began serving on the city council and as DA and other places that looked like and thought like the community. That can't happen by being absent. But there is no perfect system, and I will concede that sometimes when you are voting or you decide to vote, you are choosing not the individual idealistically who follows every single ambition and desire of your heart. Sometimes you are choosing between what you perceive to be the lesser of two evils. Which one is more aligned with what you are aligned with, who you can work with. But I believe that non-participation can happen. Now that's on the political side. On the social side, there are pressures that can be made in order to advance an agenda, but it requires community. It requires everyone working together. And so allow me to close in this regard. One of the great movements that happened in the 20th century was the Montgomery bus boycott. Many of you have heard of that. The genius of the Montgomery bus boycott was that for 387 days, the entire community said, enough is enough. We will not set foot on a bus until we can sit anywhere we desire. Imagine what dedication and commitment it would require for 387 days through winter, through rainy seasons, through being tired after working a long day, and it would be so much easier to get on this bus and get home as opposed to walk. And they said, no, my freedom is more important. So there was a young, actually an older African-American woman who came up to Dr. King after one mass meeting in 1956 in Montgomery, Alabama, and she said this to Dr. King. She said, and I'll say it the way she said it, she said, my feet is tired, but my soul is rested. Meaning that I may be exhausted physically, but my spirit is strong because I believe in the fight we're fighting. So really, you might just need to look around this room and look even beyond this room to those of similar goodwill and ask yourselves, are you willing to stand together? Are you willing to fight together? Are you willing to work together? That if somebody in this community says a degrading word towards Muslim Americans, that all of us together say, you will not get one more dollar from us. We're not going to come in your store and buy any products. We're going to withdraw our economic power and we're going to put it in a direction with someone who sees us for who we are as a part of God's creation. Will you be there for one another? The power is out here. It's in your togetherness. It's in your unity. And I still believe, as I mentioned before, that with the help of God, in fact, if God be for us, who can be against us? Thank you so much for the opportunity to share.
I think I speak for everyone when I say this was a wonderful evening. Thank you so much, Dr. Waters, for being here. Lived up to the excitement, at least over here. It's very exciting over here. I don't know about you guys. You guys, some of you went to sleep, so you have an exciting bedtime story. But just a few notes. I think we are hopefully turning the tide. One of the reasons for this effort and for us to come together is to start to unite these types of movements, to educate one another about causes, to mobilize our communities towards a common good across barriers of race, across the barriers of religion. And I think we're seeing that finally materializing in something, and hopefully we can't let those sparks go to waste. So we can't wait for another Charleston or another Chapel Hill to come together and say, no, we're not going to allow this to happen. With that being said, one of the great things that's materialized in the last month is we're actually forming a multi-faith task force. We're in the process of naming it, but both Dr. Waters and myself sit on the coordinating committee of that, which has, how many religious leaders was it? About 40 religious leaders across Dallas came together, and we decided to form this, and we're in the process of naming it right now. But we've already had a few meetings, and it is hopefully going to be a voice for our entire community, our collective communities. And what I'll encourage the entire Muslim community is, don't wait for a Muslim cause to come out. We have to be able to stand up for everyone. And that is something refreshing that we saw in light of Charleston, that many Muslims did, in fact, say that this was unacceptable. And we have to recognize, and this was the point of this evening, one of the points of this evening, that we're dealing with armed protests. They've dealt with actual churches being burned down in 2015, and a terrorist attack at a church in 2015. And we hope that no one should have to face such a thing in their places of worship, no matter what that place of worship is. So we're forming this task force. We're going to have more activities like this. I'm giving Dr. Waters an early invitation to our new mosque opening, inshallah, so he'll be there on the new mosque opening. We can count on him for that, right? So, and I want to thank him for constantly being a voice against Islamophobia. Literally every single march, every single event that's been against Islamophobia, Dr. Waters has been there, so we hope our communities can come together. We welcome you and your family for the evening. Can I just have all of our guests just raise their hands and introduce themselves, please? So all of our guests, one by one. Yes?
I'm Regina Hunt, a neighbor in Valley Ranch, from First Presbyterian, Dallas.
Great, so Regina Hunt from Valley Ranch, First Presbyterian, Dallas. Welcome. Who else do we have? Our guests?
Hey, I'm Eric Benson. I'm a writer from Texas.
Eric Benson from Texas.
I'm Hank Hunt, Valley Ranch, First Presbyterian, Dallas.
Okay, also from Valley Ranch. Others? Sister Elise, can you introduce yourself once again?
Others. We don't want to use others.
Not others as in others that are here, isn't it? Thank you, Sister Sam. Making me look bad, yeah.
Allow me to, as she begins to introduce herself, I'm exceedingly proud of my wonderful wife. Just today, she was named by the Dallas Business Journal one of the top 40 under 40 business leaders in the Metroplex. And so
You did well. I think my wife wife too, if I could see her. But welcome to our community, Sister Elise. And anyone else that can? Your mother, anyone?
There's someone.
Jeremiah, can you introduce yourself, please?
And Jeremiah came in second place in his oratorical contest today. So very proud of him.
And they have to have the coolest kids' names. So they have two daughters, Hope and Liberty. So they actually have two daughters named Hope and Liberty.